Tony Paquette, good morning, sir. Good afternoon to you out in the East Coast. How are you and where are you calling in from?
Morning, Ross. Yes, it is still morning here, barely by 2 minutes. Great to see you. Great to be on the podcast finally. I am in Darien, Connecticut.
I'm happy to have you on the Investing in Integrity podcast. This has been much anticipated by many members of our organization. Tony, want to dive right in. We don't have enough time to even scratch the surface on the topics around mentorship and leadership that we're going to cover today. So first, why don't we dive right in? And if you can just, for our listeners and our members, share a little bit about your story and your background.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ross. Happy to do that. So just a little personal background. So I grew up in Minnesota, a child of the 80s, and grew up in a sort of middle-class household. I had been in some capacity around finance for most of my life. My father's an accountant by trade. He was a teacher at a university level, owned his own accounting firm. And it's sort of been exposed to aspects of finance ever since a child. I ended up going to university on the East Coast, Brown University, graduated with a degree in economics, and started right into banking and finance out of college. My first job was at Goldman Sachs. Had a couple of different roles there in research and in trading during the started actually during the .com bubble, which was sort of a formative time for me and for a lot of people. And then moved on to different roles at a number of organizations. I've worked at Bank of America, spent a number of years at JP Morgan. Went to work at a FinTech company on the West Coast, where obviously I met you at SoFi in the consumer finance space, and currently am the chief financial officer at an asset management firm in Connecticut, Point72. So I've seen a lot of different things in terms of career. I've got 3 children of my own, so when we think about leadership, mentorship, and all those aspects, the parenting element becomes part of that as well. But that's a little bit of background on myself.
Thanks, Tony. Really appreciate you sharing. Yeah, I've always been incredibly impressed by the trajectory of your career for a whole lot of reasons, in part just because I think of your character. A lot of people who I think have moved up the ladder, if you will, as fast as you, there's a lot of ego, there's some hubris oftentimes. And you've always struck me as this very down-to-earth, grounded person. There's not a lot of ego, and you're just really trying to do your job, serve others, lead well, try to do right by your family. I think it's a perfect starting point is to talk about mentorship, because one of the reasons that I had reached out to you when I was at SoFi and started asking you for mentorship was because through a number of interactions, I started to build this perception of you as this sort of humble, thoughtful, confident leader. And you had some of these qualities and characteristics that I wanted to emulate, and that I was, passively, kind of secretly emulating. And then when we started meeting, more explicitly talking to you about, and you're a big believer in mentorship. I'd love to dive right in. I would love to understand from you, you talk a lot about mentorship and the importance of mentorship, both mentoring, and you've talked a lot about the role that mentorship has played in your own career. Would love to hear your thoughts on mentorship broadly. Why do you think it's so important, and what are some of the principles that you think about or follow when you approach mentorship?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for the kind words. Much appreciated. I think mentorship is a concept that in many ways I hadn't fully embraced on a personal or professional level till sort of several years into my career. I grew up playing a lot of sports. I know we're going to talk about the impact of sports and in particular team sports a little bit later. Playing sports, being a part of coaching environments, leadership environments, and in that realm, always taught me a lot about how other people perform, how they impact each other, how teams work together. And, the same is true in business in a lot of ways. And mentorship is sort of was a little bit of an amorphous concept for me early on in my career. But it's interesting because the longer I've been in business, the more important it has become, both in terms of developing my own mentors and becoming one for others. And, as I thought about this discussion point, there's sort of a few a few key tenets or pieces that have come to be clear in my mind on what's important. One is when you think about mentors for yourself, or at least the way I've thought about it for myself, is choosing people that you want to emulate. You use that word, and I think it's a good one. There's a great Buffett quote, and I'm somebody who I read a lot. I'm a student of history. I learn a lot from others. I read a lot of books, and I kind of keep a recommended reading list and sort of quotes that I like. But there's a great quote by Warren Buffett, one of the greatest investors of all time, and certainly our generation, is it's better to hang out with people better than you. Pick out associates whose behavior is better than yours, and you'll drift in that direction. It's so simple and so true. And so when I think about mentorship, that's a big part of it. It's about looking at people that you think or aspire to be like, seeking them out, and having a conversation. We tend to be attracted or to people that have either similar backgrounds or beliefs or whatnot. That's fine. A lot of times as a mentor, as I've become a mentor, you see yourself in people, and that's part of the reason. But I think it's really important to, when you have when you're seeking kind of a set of mentors for yourself, seek diversity. You want people that are going to tell you the truth. You want people that are going to be independent. You want people who have been through challenging times. They're going to help you grow, and ultimately, folks that are vested in your success. That's a really big part of it. The second piece I would say is, when you're cultivating mentors, be clear in your communication, be clear in your expectations. True mentorship is a time commitment. It is something that at least the way I found it, and there's friendships and different forms of mentorships, professional, personal, parenting, all kinds of different forms. But one of the things I think it's really helpful, it's been helpful for me as I've kind of assembled a number of folks that I consider mentors and ultimately friends, is being clear on sort of, here's what I'd like to hear from you. Not all the time, but at least, every so often checking in. Share things with them that help them, make themselves better. I mean, mentorship should very much be a two-way street, respecting that there's a time commitment. And then, I think the last part I would mention is become a mentor yourself. I think the more you experience things in life, in business, and you can share that with other people, the more it helps you understand what's important in a mentor-mentee relationship. The other thing I would say is mentorship's not always about age and experience. It's interesting. When I was at JP Morgan, I remember Jamie Dimon saying one time that one of his mentors was a gentleman named Jimmy Lee, who was a very sort of successful and sort of famous investment banker for many years at the JP Morgan franchise. Jimmy Lee, rest his soul, he passed away a few years ago, worked for Jamie Dimon. And Jamie Dimon called Jimmy Lee his mentor. So it's not always about where you stand in a hierarchy. A lot of it is, what are the experiences in life and in business that somebody can share? And I always found that an interesting one, because I'm sitting here thinking to myself, what mentors could Jamie Dimon possibly have? And that's the way he described it. So I think those are, some of the important things to think about. Again, I mentioned that I read a lot. There's an excellent book that John Maxwell wrote on mentoring. I think it's called Mentoring or Mentorship 101. And, those are just sort of basics and principles, but they're really, really important. And I think for those that are starting out either early in their career or developing or really just looking to kind of expand their networks, mentorship is just a great way to do this.
I appreciate you sharing another John C. Maxwell recommendation. I remember when you sent me The Leader's Greatest Return, me and Steven, our COO, we read it together, and it completely transformed how we think about leadership. So we'll +1 the book, even though I haven't read it yet. I do know you've recommended John's work before, and it's really solid. I appreciate all the points on mentorship. I appreciate you sort of laying out some of these key points that you think are important. One thing that you mentioned is that mentors should get clear on what they want from the relationship, even if it's something like career advancement in the past. You just said here, there should be communication. There should be clear expectations. How do you think those in a mentoring relationship should discuss those goals and intentions, or can discuss those goals and intentions without making the relationship suddenly feel transactional?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think number one is being transparent and honest about what it is you're trying to accomplish. The idea of a relationship being transactional often has to do with immediate or short-term goals and things that somebody's trying to accomplish. If you can be a little more strategic and long-term in your trajectory and your objectives, both in business and in life, it can often open up a part of the dialogue that is much richer and much deeper. It also allows the mentor and yourself as a mentee to kind of step away and separate from the day-to-day. Again, coming back to if it's a mentor that happens to be a boss, that can be a little complicated because your next step is something that you're doing in the workplace with this individual. But this is where having mentors that are outside the network of where you actually work is really important, because you can talk to them, you can talk to those people in ways that perhaps you may not feel either as comfortable or will get a different perspective on your direction, both as a person, as a leader, and again, we'll have some aspect of independence. I said this before, but I do think it's really important to have mentors and ask your mentors to be brutally honest with you, right? I mean, the truth isn't always pretty, but it's super important. And I do think the best mentors are ones that do that. They do it with compassion. They do it with, sensitivity. But it's really important that they give you the truth. And I think that's an important element.
That's something I actually wanted to touch on, Tony. You've said in the past, we had you on with Matt Collier, one of our other advisors, for a group discussion with our students about mentorship specifically. And you had mentioned that you believe it's important for mentors to, quote, challenge you, tell you the truth and the hard truth. How does a mentee cultivate a relationship where you can expect to be challenged and told difficult truths? How do you create that dynamic?
It's a good question again. I'm not sure there's a perfect way. I'd say a couple things. One, as a mentee, and again, as you become a mentor, you'll see this from the other seat. Express the areas that you have challenges. Be honest. Say, I feel like I'm struggling with this. I'm not good at this. Do you see the same thing, mentor? And can you give me some feedback on it? Like, open the door for them. Make it not easy, but let them know that you want to talk about this. Oftentimes, and especially early in a relationship, somebody might be hesitant to give you the hard, direct truth for fear or concern of damaging the relationship or closing the door. And so if you could open it with them or for them and tell them, look, this is what I want, and I could really use your clear feedback on it. That's helpful. Again, it's a communication piece. I think the other thing I would say on in general on this point is, don't force mentorship relationships. And this isn't, this could be around friendships or other types of relationships too. You can't force them. They take time. They take reps. The idea that you say, hey, that person is somebody I want to emulate. I'm going to go make them my mentor, and I'm going to call them every week until they start mentoring me. It doesn't work that way, right? We're humans. We have a different dynamic and element about us, how we develop relationships. So be patient, be consistent, and I think it's okay to be persistent. But let the relationship flourish. And I think when you do that, and oftentimes if you can share things, and one of the things that I've tried to do is just share little nuggets of information, either about yourself or about the world or about them that you think they might be interested in, right? I'll send a text to somebody who's a mentor of mine that I know it's something they're interested in. Why? Because I pay attention to their life. And it's a way to connect with them. And what it does is it sends not even a subliminal message, a direct message. I'm thinking about you. I'm paying attention to you. I'm asking you to pay attention to me. I may not be asking you right now, but down the road I will. And over time, I think that helps. Again, this is relationship. It's relationship management. It's not that different in other relationships. The difference here is you have a sort of a separate, it's not family necessarily. It's not your daily life. It's somebody you might be engaging with on a weekly, monthly basis, even less frequently, but somebody who understands where your mindset and your frame of mind is coming from, and somebody that you can open the door and make their, make them giving their feedback easy for them.
That makes complete sense. And I think it actually segues into the final question on mentorship that I wanted to ask you. You've said in the past that there is a reward factor for parties on both sides of the mentoring equation. And I've definitely found that to be true. I mean, obviously, you as a mentor of mine, other mentors of mine, I have gotten so much value in our relationship and have learned so much. I've grown a lot. You've accelerated my growth trajectory. And I mentor a lot of our students and scholars of finance. I have several mentees who I meet with on a structured, regular basis. I have a lot of students reach out to ask for 30 minutes, 60 minutes for a coffee if they have a challenge they're going through. And I've found it incredibly rewarding to be the mentor also. I want to ask you if you can share a bit, and you can use our relationship as an example, or speak in the abstract here. Can you tell us a bit about what you believe young mentees or mentees generally can bring to the table to give value to the mentor? And said another way, from the experiences you've had mentoring people, what are some of the characteristics of your mentees that you have found particularly rewarding to mentor?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, a few things sort of come to mind. Number one, I would say what makes a, mentee, I don't know, desirable or rewarding. It's a few things. I think it's the feedback loop between what you're sharing with them and how they react to it. So as a mentor, oftentimes you're maybe not early days, but eventually sort of giving advice or ideas, and you'll often watch or ask the mentee, what did you do with this, right? Did you do something with the information I gave you? And if I gave you advice, how did you take it? I don't think people expect, certainly I don't, when you give advice to somebody that they take and do everything you say. That's not the point of any mentor or mentee or any relationship for that matter. But I do think it's important that if you're going to take the time to share the idea, that they ingest it, they consider it, and there's a thoughtful sort of use for the relationship, or for the advice. So I think seeing what people do after you give them advice is important, right? I think anybody who's giving advice and can rightfully say, hey, they did this, and now I feel some part of ownership of their either success or failures or whatever, that's important. Two, I think the mentee sharing ideas that are potentially even outside the realm of what the mentor has come up with. They're coming from a very different perspective. Oftentimes there's sometimes there's an age gap we talked about, and in today's day and age, there's a very big difference between somebody starting out in business right now, coming out of college, and when I came out of college. And so I appreciate the ideas that come from those conversations. They're seeing things that I just probably would not see. And not only does it sort of keep me young, but it keeps you posted on like what's relevant and what matters in their lives and in the world. I think a degree of consistency and energy is important. Somebody who is willing to continue to try to get better, that pays attention when you say, too much of this, too little of this. Again, that's sort of reacting to feedback. But somebody that is willing to bring their energy to the dynamic, and then importantly, somebody who respects. I don't want to say boundaries, but respects the time element, right? We all have a lot of things going on in our lives, and oftentimes, if you're a mentor, as you become a mentor, you want to take on a lot of them. I personally like to try and mentor as many people as I can, but it's hard, and it does take time. And in order to do it well and to do it right, or at least the way I would like to be seen as a mentor, there's not unlimited time, and I've got a family and job and all those things. So I think somebody who respects that is important. But a lot of it is what they do with the information. How do they respect and trust the relationship, and what do they bring back to you? that helps.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing this notion that bringing ideas as a mentee is really helpful. It actually makes me think back to our time at SoFi. And when I first started meeting with you, right, if you recall, when I came over to your desk, asked if we could grab lunch, we had our first couple of lunches, and you would say, Ross, I'm curious, what are things like? What are you seeing? What are you hearing among people at the firm? Kind of culturally, what's on people's minds? What's going well? What are their concerns? And I've never shared this with you. I'll tell you this in the podcast now. Before every one of our lunches, even our first lunch, I sat down and I thought, okay, here are like 5 questions Tony could ask. And here are some things I think that he would need to know, that he should know, right? So I actually viewed that first lunch as an opportunity to share information with you about what was going on in middle management at SoFi and the kind of tenor of the people, if you will, the morale of the firm, or at least my division. And so when you asked, I actually remember this, you asked, hey, what's going on? And I thought I tried to share some very substantive, succinct points on, this is going well, this is going well. Leadership is being perceived as indecisive here and here. People are really excited about this and this. And I could almost sense this clear shift in your posture in that first lunch, where suddenly you just started firing questions at me. And at the end of that, you kept firing questions at me and said, hey, let's get lunch again. I want to talk more. And at our next lunch, you had a number of questions again. And I came prepared to try to just be valuable and be useful. And so one thing I did want to ask, I think it actually relates to teamwork a lot, because on a team, you've got to share information. You have to be open. You have to be transparent. And one thing I wanted to briefly touch on and kind of segue into is sports. You played sports for much of your formative years, from grade school through college. You now serve on Brown's Presidential Advisory Board for Athletics. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how team sports have influenced your leadership, your life, just your view on the world, and how you apply that to your success in your career.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that. Yeah, as you mentioned, I've been around some form of athletics, competitive athletics for most of my life, and now getting into that phase of parenting and coaching, where it's more of an observer than an active participant. Although I still try and bring out the spikes every once in a while, but I'd say a few things that are just really, really important and direct connections between sports, competitive sports, and a lot of aspects of life, particularly business, but many others as well. Number one is teamwork. So I played a bunch of different sports, but the one I was probably most competitive at was American football, and I still call American football the quintessential team sport. It can be obviously rough and dangerous at times, but what's really interesting about the game, and I think it's unique in this respect, is there's 11 players on the field. They each have different positions. In almost every case, not every case, one person cannot do the other person's job. Give you an example, and it depends on what level. If you're if you're 5-year-olds, okay, everybody's playing the same thing. But if you're at a high school, collegiate, or professional level, the center or the offensive lineman cannot do the wide receiver's job. The wide receiver, well, in most cases, can't do the quarterback's job, but the quarterback can't do the running back's job. The tight end can't do, and so your reliance on your teammates is not only important, but it's quintessential for success. If the team doesn't operate as a team, it will fail. And so your reliance, when you look down the line or you look at your teammates, on them, each of those individuals doing their job respectfully, is paramount for the success of the team. And so I think it teaches a lot about teamwork and reliance on others, number one. And by the way, football's not the only sport that teaches it. Every sport in some form teaches this, team sports. Two, I would say leadership in general. So in any organized function, business, family, athletics, other nonprofits, human leadership, human dynamics evolve around individuals that arise either through sort of an elected form, official or unofficial, but leaders emerge, right? And oftentimes it's how those leaders behave. It's the words they use to inspire. It's how they conduct their own behaviors themselves that impact others. And it's how people choose to willingly follow those leaders, right? It's one thing to be named, coach or captain by somebody else, above you. It's another thing to be elected captain amongst your peers. Those are very different things. And in team sports, oftentimes, and this is one of the things I really relish about team sports, is you elect your captain amongst each other, and that gives them the responsibility, to some degree the authority, but really the responsibility to be a representative of the group. So when you think about leadership, and oftentimes this is the case in business, although not all the time, right? Sometimes people rise through the ranks of an organization and they weren't elected by their peers, and you can tell when that's the case. But I think that's one thing I really like about about team sports. And then the last one, I think this is very applicable to many aspects of life, is it teaches you discipline. It teaches you grit. It teaches you preparation. Especially the higher level of competition you get into in sports, no different than business. It is an incredibly competitive world out there, whether it's, finance and investing, or FinTech, or entrepreneurship, or raising money in a nonprofit organization. The competition is high, and preparation for the game, for that one opportunity you have to meet somebody, for the actual event, and even in many cases, preparation for the sake of creating your own routines and discipline are super important. I mean, obviously in athletics, you're talking about athletic physical training often, but I will tell you, there's a lot of books and studies on this sports, sports medicine or sports study in the last 20 years, that the mental training and preparation around particularly the highest, most elite level sport is as or more important than the physical aspect. And so, again, I think that's very applicable to aspects of life, business, to direct corollary. And I think you learn those things when you play, at least I did. And then, it's not, the other thing you bring with you is the relationships. So, when you're on a team, not dissimilar from when you work at a company, you meet people, you develop bonds, you develop relationships, you carry those with you forever. And, the way you form relationships on a field of play is different than in a workplace, but you have these memories stick with you. In fact, one of my dear friends is now the head coach at Brown University, and I'm talking to him all the time. And I'm talking to him about football. I'm giving him recruits. I'm sharing lessons from work and business. And yeah, maybe we're living a little bit of the glory days every once in a while, but this is like, we formed a bond and a relationship on the field 20 plus years ago. And so anyway, I think there's a lot of, important elements of sport. There's some great, as I mentioned, books I like to read. There's a couple that I think are really good that I would point out on leadership. So John Wooden, legendary basketball coach, UCLA, I can't remember how many national championships. I don't want to butcher it. He's got just a phenomenal book called Wooden on Leadership. And, I read it a couple of years ago for the first time. It might've been written 30 years ago, but his elements and his principles are they're so enduring and so timeless, and in many aspects so basic. They apply to literally everything. And so I've given, I like to gift books, as you know. I've given that book to a lot of people. Yes, I do. In part because it's very easy to understand the rules of basketball. Everybody knows who John Wooden is, but until you actually sit down and read this and say, wow, this applies to every aspect of my entire life, you kind of don't. I didn't even make those connections until, a couple of years ago. And so I think there's all kinds of books. Bill Walsh and some of the great sports coaches and leaders of all time really do a good job transitioning sport into life, sport into business. But that's what I take away from them.
There's so much there to unpack, and I actually want to pull on two threads there and segue into a conversation about leadership. You talked about, number one, teamwork being a key benefit of team sports and something you learn that applies to business and life. And two, you talk about resilience, discipline, grit, tenacity. The early morning. We talk about the early mornings, getting on the field. And what's interesting is, I think leadership, requires habits and disciplines that maximize the output of teamwork, that improve collaboration and teamwork. And I remember one of our first coffee meetings as well at SoFi. I was going on one of my silent retreats, and you were like, "Silent retreat? What's that?" And I said, "Oh, well, I've got this one-page document with my mission, my core values, my principles, and every 6 months I go away, turn my phone off for 3 days, and I reflect, I read, I journal, I just synthesize life, and I update my values and principles." And I saw you immediately perk up, and you said, "I have a one-page document with 20 leadership principles that I'm going to share with you. And over our next lunch, I want to hear more about your process on these retreats." And that, to me, for myself, is one of my leadership disciplines. It is every 6 months, just turn off the 80-hour weeks, get some silence and solitude to think deeply and reflect on life, and really assess who I am, what I stand for, and incorporate my recent learnings into my operating model going forward. And that was something we related on. And I remember when you sent me the PDF, APP's 20 leadership principles, I read it and was floored. I was like, oh, it was one of those moments where you're like, there's so much wisdom here that I can't even grasp yet. But one day, if I spend enough time with Tony Paquette and I live to be old enough, I will understand all of everything in this one-page document that he's got. And so you're one of the very few people I've ever met outside of like my students at Scholars of Finance who like also have a one-pager of their values and principles. And so I immediately felt this kinship and this really intense respect for you as well, having read them. I would love it if you can share a bit about how you developed your 20 leadership principles and really just talk more broadly about leadership. What are some of the leadership principles that you think are most important for all of our listeners to consider? Whether students, a lot of students who are listening, young professionals who are listening, all the way to we have listeners who are partners and C-level executives at top financial firms.
No, it's interesting. The concept of writing these things down, again, hadn't really occurred to me until probably 7 or 8 years ago, when I had seen a document that had somebody else's. And I don't think it was called Principle. I forgot exactly what it was, but something that kind of laid out a set of behaviors or ideas in how it was really a workplace oriented document. But when I read it, and I remember it was pretty short, and it just similarly had sort of like clicked on a number of levels for me. And in many ways, these are behaviors and values that I have held deeply to in my own sort of mind for many years. And how you conduct yourself and how in the workplace and at home and in business and in life is something that each one of us owns ourselves. But I had never actually written it down. I had never written these explicit things down. And so I said, at that point, I said, well, I'm just going to write. I remember reading this other person's document. There was 2 of them on there that stood out to me, and I stole those. So many of these, and I've told you this, are things that I have, and I actually write this at the top of the document. I mean, these are, many of these principles are taken from the wisdom of others, and some of them are developed and honed by my own experience. All of them are in some form, but oftentimes they're just timeless, in some cases basic things. But writing them down, making them a little personal, refining them, and trying to make them as succinct and as clear as you can, it is the exercise. So it's interesting because it was probably over the course of about 6 months. I hadn't shared these with anybody. In fact, I've still shared them with very few people until now. You've mentioned it on a podcast, so more people know. But I've
I'll just share the PDF on my website.
Yeah, right. No, and listen, I am pretty open about this. I'm happy to share these things. If nothing else, then if it helps somebody else in their life or their journey, then power to them. And this is, there's nothing copyrighted about any of these, but I was looking through them because I knew we were going to touch on that for this discussion. And again, even today, I go through every once in a while and we'll tweak the wording, because I think there's always something very elegant about conveying a concept in as few words as possible. I think that's a very important aspect of communication, is the written word, and keeping it very simple and short. But I mean, I'll read a couple of them, but the ones that really stick out to me and have become more important as I've gone through my career. Number one, and it will always be number one, is lead by example, right? You as an individual, and we look introspectively at ourselves, you control your own actions. You don't control the world around you. There are some things you may have influence on, some things you don't. How you react is almost always more important than in any event that happens. And so when you're leading and you're in a position of leadership, example matters a ton. People are watching, people are paying attention, and you can't forget that. And if you hold that at the center of your mind and you allow your behaviors to, or force your behaviors in some cases to be somebody that you want to be more like, then I think that's kind of the golden rule. Some of the other ones that I try and be, some of them are principles, some of them are more behavior oriented. One is listen first, speak second. Listen 4 times as much as you speak. The more you get into a leadership position, the bigger your teams. The team wants to hear what you have to say, but oftentimes it's really, really important to not only bite your tongue. You don't want to squelch or suffocate ideas that could come from an organization by sharing yours first. Took me a while to learn that. Now every meeting I start with other people's ideas. Some people don't like it, but that's, and I will eventually share my views. And if there's something that's absolutely critical that we get out at the outset of a meeting, of course. So not every situation is the same, but listening more than you're speaking without question, very important. Become a servant leader. I think you referenced it earlier in the discussion. Putting others' interests before your own, sacrificing for the team, critically important. Always doing the right thing. And I wrote this. The follow-up to that is, even or especially when nobody is watching. This is about your own pride. This is about how you do anything is how you do everything. And you can't cheat yourself. If you cheat yourself, you're cheating everybody else. So there's sort of a zero compromise element to this. And I think that fits very much with integrity, both externally, but also perhaps more importantly, internally. Be honest, humble, and willing to show vulnerability. I think the word vulnerability and leadership for a lot of people, and I think for a long time, were antithetical. I think there's a style of leadership that's, particularly when you think about some of the greatest military leaders or even political leaders that have, and still today, show effectively no vulnerability. And perhaps for some people that works. I think for the vast majority of people that I've worked with and some of the most impactful leaders that I've seen, it's in fact that exact vulnerability that makes them impactful. It makes them human. It makes them relatable. And so, notwithstanding the fact that many of us want to be seen as strong and powerful and whatever, omnipotent or whatever it is, you just define your word, it actually doesn't work with the majority of human beings, because the majority of people following you want to be related to. And the way to do that is to show your vulnerabilities and to show that you're human, because nobody is in fact perfect. A couple other ones, be a truth seeker, be firm but flexible, remain calm in times of crisis. This is, again, applies to a lot of things in life. In business, I've been through a number of different crises. Your natural reaction oftentimes is, and it's a, this is innate in our human, building, is, your systems kick in terms of system 1, system 2, and our hunter-gatherer instincts kick in and adrenaline gets going. But oftentimes that's when poor decisions are made. And so remaining calm, particularly in times of crisis, is important. Be a coach and be coachable. So we talked a little bit about this in terms of mentorship. As a leader, you're a de facto coach often, and you're in some cases thwarted into positions of leadership, and you're not ready for it. But being coachable is very important. It allows you to continually get better. I mentioned earlier, this is one where Beck Buffett's quote: "Hire people that are better than you." As a leader, when you're actually building a team, that's a pretty hard thing. How many times have you worked with or seen people where in sort of a self-protective mode, they don't want to surround themselves with excellent people for fear of other people taking their job? it is, it took me a while to figure this one out. It is the exact wrong reaction. The best you can be as a leader is to hire people that will, not kick your butt. You have to be able to, number one, keep up, but that will make you better and allow you to move on to bigger and better things. And until people get past that sort of a little bit of its ego, a little bit of its, self security, it's super important. But I am always looking to hire people better and smarter than me. It's actually, not that hard with the crop of people coming out of, into the workplace today. Listen to your gut. Over time, you'll develop, intuitions that are really important. There's that internal aspect that you can't, if something's eating at you, there's a reason, right? Our conscience is a uniquely human feature that if ignored can be really, really dangerous. And so oftentimes, you have this little niggling fact in your mind or issue in your mind, and there's something there. You cannot ignore it. You at least need to acknowledge what the issues are. I recognize your limitations, develop a growth mindset, be a lifelong learner. An important one is embracing diversity while promoting meritocracy. And I put those two together because diversity is critical for success, both as a leader in any organization. But it should not and cannot come at the expense of some element of meritocracy, and meritocracy is defined in a lot of different ways to people. But I think diversity is it's critically important for the health of an organization and ensuring that you as a leader you're getting a round set of viewpoints, and it is proactive, right? I mean, you have to seek people from different backgrounds and different mindsets. And if you don't, you will end up with everybody around the table that looks just like you. And, that can be a really, really dangerous place. So it's an important one to embrace. And then, one thing we haven't talked a lot about, but I said, take care of your mind, body, and soul. I think, as a leader, as a performer, as anything, for me anyway, understanding, how I eat, exercise, rest, my outside relationships, all those things, when we come to work, you bring your whole self. And I think this is sort of a new concept, and not that new, but a lot of organizations have really leaned into this concept of how do we bring our whole self to the workplace. It's so important, right? You don't check your personal life at the door when you walk into the workplace. You might not be talking about those things, and you may likely focus on work specific things, but we're human beings. You can't compartmentalize aspects of your life. And so understanding your own dynamic, and your body will change over time, and your mindset, all these things, but you have to be proactively aware of that. And I think a lot of people that I've seen in business that tend to work very hard can burn themselves out, and they're not doing themselves or the people that they work with any favors. And then, along with that is an important one, and I bookend it with the first and the second. These aren't in any prioritization order. Is know your priorities in life. Understand what's important to you in terms of family, goals, objectives. Part of it is an exercise like this, which is writing these things down, and they change over time, right? People do goals, they do personal goals, New Year's resolutions. I never used to do that stuff. And, I do them a little bit now, but oftentimes it's about just making sure you've got some element of that true north, embedded in your maybe not daily thought process, but certainly with some frequency. And you've mentioned your silent retreats, which was a really, sort of something that I've never quite fathomed, considering the family and all the obligations I've got in life, but it's really, really important. One thing, I mentioned a few things to read. One of the pieces is actually not a book; it's a speech. But one of the better pieces that I mentioned in this realm is a lecture by a gentleman named William Deresiewicz. It's called Solitude and Leadership. It was a lecture delivered to the West Point plebe class, I think, of 2010. And it's not that long of a read, but it is just an excellent, and I go back, this is one of those I read every year. I reread it every year because it highlights the importance of just those two words in leadership, how important it is to take time to yourself, to understand thyself, how to focus on it, it's very practical and meaningful. And again, things not that I didn't really think about for probably the first 10 or maybe even 15 years of my career, but have become increasingly important in business and in life over the last 5 to 10.
Tony, there's so much to react to there. What I will say is I want to pin an ask, or more of just a statement that I'm going to have you back on the podcast a second and probably a third time. It'd be fun to go through some of these principles in detail and in depth. And as you were sharing yours and kind of reading through some of those, I was picking up on the ones that I also, like you saw there were a couple in this one pager that you saw that you actually put into your own principles. And I was even noting some of the things you shared from yours that I put into mine. One of those, listen attentively 4 times more than you speak. People often say, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth. And I remember reading your principles and seeing instead of 2x, it's 4x. And that really struck me and it stood out in a way that was memorable. So that was one that I lifted, that I took, that I found really, really helpful. And then even you saying, just do the right thing always. I put that directly into my principles as well. So I'll just +1 that. I think it's just delightful to have mentors that you can learn from, whose principles you can adopt. Especially, I just spent the last decade in my 20s. And I tell my friends, I talk to older friends, especially saying, I feel like I'm still a child. Like I know so little. It's so helpful and when I was young, I didn't think this, when I was like 16 or 17 or 18, like most 16, 17-year-olds, I thought I knew everything and my parents were outdated. But there's really something to be said for wisdom cultivated through experience over time. I know we're coming up on time, so I do want to hit you with 2 questions before we have to wrap up, if that's okay.
Okay.
If I segue.
Sure. Yep.
A lot of these values, a lot of these principles, what Scholars of Finance, we talk about inspiring character and integrity in the finance leaders of tomorrow. And there's a very clear case for those principles manifesting in our behavior, with our teammates, with our boss, with our direct reports, our vendors, our customers, in the people interactions. But then ultimately, in your role at Point72, and for a lot of people listening to this call, they either are currently or will one day be managing millions or billions of dollars. We had Scott Mather on not too long ago. They have over $2 trillion on the balance sheet of assets, right, at PIMCO. And ultimately, we need to see these values and these principles manifesting in the investment decisions, where we deploy this capital, understanding that where we deploy that capital incentivizes human effort and energy, right? The future we invest in is the future that we receive or that we materialize. And one thing we're trying to push our students to do is to learn every day, how can they make finance a force for good very practically? Once they have their mission, they have their purpose to help others and make the world better, they have their values and principles they adhere to, what does it actually look like when they're a portfolio manager one day or when they're a CFO one day? And, $800 million of assets has to find a new home. So as we wrap up, the second to last question I want to ask is, how do you think we collectively, all of us, current and future finance leaders in the industry, whether VC, private equity, hedge funds, asset management, how can we make finance a force for good? How can finance be used to create the good society, right? To improve human flourishing, solve the world's problems. How can finance be used for impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not an easy one to answer, but at its core, the reason I wanted to be involved with Scholars of Finance from the beginning was because that's what you're attempting to do as an organization. And a lot of it's around education for the leaders, next generation of leaders in the finance world. And, when I think about concepts like a free market economy, what matters, how things, there's labor and there's capital, and where we choose to spend our time as individuals and who we hire and bring on board, and a lot of things we talked about in terms of leadership, that's kind of the labor part, right? There's two aspects of output in the economy. Capital is the other, and for many years there's a balance between those two, and that balance between capital and labor shifts over time. But without capital, oftentimes businesses, ideas, people, economies, countries, societies fail to fulfill their fullest potential. And so when I think about this concept of finance as a force for good, I think oftentimes it's as a leader or as an asset allocator, you have an objective of what you're trying to do. And if you're managing money and investments for example, limited partners, your objective is to do so and earn a rate of return, perhaps the highest risk tolerated adjusted rate of return within a certain parameter of investment guidelines. And for many years, that even the concept of a corporation was all about the shareholder, right? So the Business Roundtable, and this has been a pretty hot topic over the last 2 or 3 years. The Business Roundtable, of which my former boss or CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, I think is still the head of the Business Roundtable. They actually shifted, I think it was 2 years ago, to a concept of stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism. And it was I don't know that it was necessarily as profound as it often gets made out to be. The prevailing thought for the last 50 years had been the corporation solely focused around shareholders, but we've come to appreciate that it is not inconsistent to have the broader stakeholder at the center. So that's employees, that's the communities in which we operate, that's obviously investors, but it's exogenous impacts to the environment or externalities, I should say. And so, I think those are really good developments in the world of business at large. I think for finance, it's about mobilizing capital to those areas that promote stakeholder capitalism in their most effective way. And, oftentimes, as I said, ideas, concepts, business propositions are, if they're not fed with capital, are able to flourish to their fullest. And that's a lot of what venture capital is about, is putting ideas, putting capital at risk for ideas that might be somewhat unlikely or low probability of outcome, but extremely high probability of impact when and if. And I think, as I've been involved in the private investment space over the last several years, it's really become clear and really enjoyable for me to kind of see those projects that garner venture capital, and warrant venture capital investment. And I think things that are consistent with a healthier economy, a healthier environment, a safer, more transparent, more open society, a more balanced society, and balanced objectives around all kinds of aspects of improving standards of living in not just the United States, but around the world. And there's differing opinions on how you get there, right? What level of government involvement, what level of private sector. But I really don't think there's a whole lot of debate around the concept that stakeholder capitalism has merit and logic. And so when I think about finance as a force for good, it's really sort of half of that equation in any free market, society, where, capital and labor are the two inputs. And so I think, educating people on how to think about these things, it has to be, in a balanced way, right? If ESG investing is a very, I don't want to say hot trend. It's a evolution in the investing industry, in environmental, social, and governance, and for the right good reasons. Why? Because those things ultimately generate better returns over time. Much like the concept of diversity. For a long time, people felt like, diversity, whether it's in management suites or boards or employee bases at large, was about trying to find something that's balanced for society. Okay, yes, it is, but it's actually very consistent. And there's plenty of studies on this, that it actually leads to better performance, higher returns. So these aren't mutually exclusive concepts, and they're not competing with each other. So I think, to me, the idea of finance being a force for good is, how can you lift the boats of all participants in a society, in a country, in an organization, and do it with transparency, the aspects of a lot of the things that scholars of finance is teaching, compassion and integrity. These are all really important. And I think one aspect of it is to talk about it. It's something that, at least when I was coming up in business, there was ethics training and there was business training, and they were almost separate. They weren't totally ingrained, and not that they're, that those things weren't achieving some of their objectives. But I think as we talk about these things in a very open and transparent way, and one of the things I love about Scholars of Finance is it is entirely dedicated to that, and we need more organizations like Scholars of Finance. I think you guys are doing an amazing job getting into the universities, the leading universities around this country. We're finally starting to get the responsiveness from a number of big companies in finance that see these are the kind of people they want to be bringing on at a young age, because then they grow up to be the leaders, and it helps their performance over time. So there's a very naturally self-sustaining element to it, which is the other piece of it that I would mention.
I really appreciate it, Tony, and I appreciate you referencing the Business Roundtable stakeholder capitalism announcement a couple of years ago. I was very, very excited for it when it was released, because I think when we even ask ourselves, what is the end? If performance is a means to some end, what is the end of that means that financial performance is? And ultimately, I think it is, and this is a very reductive kind of summarized view, but this is something we could have 2 or 3 more conversations on the podcast over the years. But I think it is creating economic efficiency to grow the economic pie, to eliminate the systemic problems that face society. I talk to my students a lot at the risk of sounding grandiose, that if as a species we play our cards right, we could all be alive when the UN actually sees the Sustainable Development Goals all achieved. Like, we could eradicate poverty, we could eradicate hunger. Every human on earth could have education, healthcare, a home, right? Clean, potable drinking water. Scott Harrison, one of our advisory board members, the CEO of Charity Water, we talk about this. People often will almost sort of scoff at you as this young, idealistic, naive 20-something or 30-something, but we'll announce this publicly, but someone just gave us $1 million donation 2 weeks ago, hearing that vision, that finance and capital can be deployed to its highest and most productive use to the tune of billions and trillions of dollars, eliminating societal problems, therefore increasing human flourishing, therefore increasing prosperity for all people, right? So I'm super thrilled about it, and I appreciate your point there. And I think what you said segued into my final question. You've been incredibly involved in Scholars of Finance, right? Our relationship began as just a couple lunches at SoFi, you becoming a mentor, then you joining our advisory board. Now you're a member of our Alpha Fund. You've made a lot of introductions to some of the leaders you've mentioned on the call today to help us grow Scholars of Finance. You've spoken to our students. You've just been such a huge advocate for our work, and with your time, with your resources, and we're incredibly grateful for that. But I want to ask my final question for all of our listeners, whether students, young professionals, seasoned investors, and financial executives. Why would you encourage them to get involved in Scholars of Finance? Why SOF, and why should they get involved?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks. I'd say a couple things. One of the things I like about the organization and the way you're all building it is it's very entrepreneurial in its spirit. And you even mentioned this in your last comment. It's visionary, and probably I don't know if we're going to be able to see all of the UN goals be achieved in our lifetime, but we should always be striving.
I'll give you an over/under.
But it actually, the debate isn't a binary yes or no, will these things be accomplished? It's progress, right? The key objective of any well-meaning organization, good intentioned leader, parent, whatnot, is progress. And I think the mission stands for progress. In specifically the field of finance being a force for good and creating integrity. And I also think it's my other selling point is it's a very self-selective group, right? You don't join a group saying we're promoting integrity in the leader and character in the leadership of tomorrow with malintent, right? It's sort of mutually exclusive. And if people do join with some sort of ulterior motives, they're going to be quickly rooted out, right? And they won't fit. And I don't think you've had any of that, but conceptually, it's a naturally self-selecting group, and so I think that's important. And again, I think over time, the idea of as somebody who looks for bringing in younger talent into an organization, hiring people, this kind of credential, I think is important. I mean, one of the things we've talked about at Scholars of Finance is how do you make that sort of a household name recognition for hiring companies, bodies, managers in the finance industry. If that becomes the case, it'll be like, oh, this person's a Scholars of Finance grad. Like we understand at least something about what they stand for and why. I think if nothing else, that's an important element for young people to consider. And it also, it allows them to kind of see the opportunities to have an impact and where throughout the financial services industry, functions or groups like this can really make a difference. So again, it may not be for everybody, but I think it's a great mission. I love the ambition, and yeah, it's hard, but you've as you've said, you've brought a lot of very impactful people to the table, and I've seen it grow over the last 2.5 years, and it's kind of just getting started. So I don't know if that's a selling point for everybody, but I've really appreciated being involved. I've really enjoyed it. It's been rewarding for me. Happy to spend the time. I love seeing the young people and students. I get to go back to my alma mater, Brown University, and speak to them, and people ask all these questions, and it's a great thing. There's ways to do that outside of this organization. I do it in a lot of other capacities as well, but this is a unique one, and it allows me to sort of touch a different segment of young students and people, particularly diverse. I think that the student base that you've attracted to be a part of this is at least what I've seen is incredibly diverse. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I think that's really, really important, as we've talked about. And so, so I think it's a feeder and a funnel for some of the greatest investment or finance leadership of the next generation.
Thanks, Tony. I very much appreciate it. Appreciate all the kind words and all your time today. I know you've got to run and you've got a family to take care of. Speaking of knowing your priorities, so just want to thank you so much for your time, for coming on the Investing in Integrity podcast. I'm excited to have you back on again. And I think we'll have to do an episode where we dive into your 20 principles. And then we'll have to do an episode where we debate whether or not we can achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the next 50 to 70 years. So those will be 2 fun conversations to have in the future. Thanks so much, Tony.
Good. Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Rob.
Appreciate it.